Hello, and thank you for joining us in another installment of our firm's In the Spotlight in another installment of our firm's In the Spotlight Leadership Series. I'm Victor Kleinman, leader of Kingsley Gate Partners Global Life Sciences practice. I'm delighted to be talking today with Dr. Antoine Yver, who, it has just recently been announced, has joined Centessa Pharmaceuticals as their Chief Medical Officer. Good morning, Antoine, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Good morning, Victor. Delighted to be here.
Thank you. Just some background on Antoine. He's a board-certified pediatric oncologist and holds an MD with honors from University Paris-Saclay. He has over 30 years of global pharma experience, and through his contributions or direct leadership, has achieved approvals for 11 new cancer drugs and numerous new indications and label extensions. Early in his career, he held clinical development roles at Schering-Plough, Merck, J&J, Aventis, and Rhône-Poulenc. At AstraZeneca, he served in multiple global development roles with ever-increasing responsibilities, culminating as Senior Vice President, Global Medicine Head Oncology, and Global Medicine Development Head, China. He played a pivotal leadership role in the turnaround of their oncology organization and pipeline and the development and approvals of numerous game-changing oncology therapies, including Tagrisso and Lynparza. After AstraZeneca, he joined Daiichusekyo, where he served as Executive Vice President and Global Head, R&D Oncology, and Chair of their Global Cancer Enterprise. Through his leadership, the company turned around their oncology pipeline as well, receiving approval for Enhertu and signing major co-development deals with AstraZeneca and other strategic partners. He plans to leverage all his leadership lessons learned as Centessa's first ever Chief Medical Officer. Antoine is also a husband, a father of 10, and a grandfather. He is very active in his community, is a school board member, and has a deep personal commitment to charitable philanthropy. We'll also talk about family and about life not being about all business all the time. Antoine, let's go back to the beginning for a few minutes and talk about your interest in, or really I should say, because I know your passion in medicine, and tell us about your desire to get your medical degree.
So thank you first for the very nice word. So my drive to medicine came for a drive to care for others, as far as I remember, from very young age. It was, the primary driver was the willingness to offer support and care. And that naturally translated into my head, as far as I can recall, in the practice of medicine. So it's not like that I weighted different options. I just naturally was drawn to medicine. But this career was then further influenced, by a couple of critical steps. The very first one is that, medical school in 1975 or 6, in France was an admission on the basis of national exams or similar to national exams. And I was an okay high school student, but actually not particularly well performing, barely passed, if you will. But it was very, very committed to medicine. And thus, after this 1 year, it took this national like, and then handed up the first out of 2,700 in my, grade, to my total surprise. So I say that not because it's out of claim, but it just set me for two things. One is the belief that I could do what I wanted to do because I had the mind to do this, but more importantly, it also, I was then thrown into the hospital ward on the second year, this is how it worked. And I was blessed by a nurse of a certain age and certainly of a great experience who quickly understood that this young man, with confidence that I was, had to understand what medicine was. And then you imagine a November day, gray, wet, and I have a white coat, I have the stethoscopes, and my belief that I will be able to do what I wanted to do, and that confidence. And then she asked me to check on a patient, her name was Mary, and send me to that single bedroom or bed room and to check on that person. And I walk in with that confidence, open the doors and ask, how are you? And I'm immediately confronted with a woman of the age of probably 30, 35, with a massive chest wall recurrence of a breast cancer. So you could open in the air, where you could see the wounds, the blood, the infection, and the smell, and eyes directed at me. And I immediately knew that it was not how are you, but who are you, which was the right question. And that threw me into the second half of a practice of medicine, which is the care aspect and not only the knowledge aspect. And obviously I engaged with that person, deeply for 10 or 15 minutes. She had pictures of her two kids on the side table. And she actually died a couple of days later. But that person, and Mary, is the one who forged me essentially and on that drive to use what I can to the best of my abilities, to essentially, and continues to this day, to be the driver, to do all what I, and then obviously my teams and beyond, can humanly do to deliver good medicine. So, because it is our duty, our obligation, and that obligation stems from that early event. The second shaping event in my early life were the quick realization as I was a medical student that in that time and age, doctors, adult doctors, or adult medicine doctors, would actually not speak the truth. They would not lie to patients, meaning not proactively lie, but they would not be able and willing to stand in front of patients and actually tell them the truth with respect to the prospect, the risk, the uncertainty, or potentially their own demise and deaths. And thus, we're evading this, just like I was confronted with Mary and choose not to evade that first engagement. And this, for me, was a clear driver towards the practice of pediatrics, where truth was centered, both with the kids themselves as well as with the parents and the caregiving. And these were the two factors, which defined my commitment to cancer and my commitment to pediatric and care. So, and to this day, this is how I understand medicine. I was informed very early on that the practice of medicine is all about caring and applying the mind and understanding the people's needs. And that you can do this even in a pharma world because you actually do exactly the same thing. You understand the people, you understand the disease, you apply your science, and you care for patients.
An amazing example about as you said, at best, average high school student, but you found your passion and you found the right space for you to make a difference. And going back to that nurse positioning you to have some awesome responsibility for even a few days with that patient. It must have been a big move for you to decide to leave practicing medicine and seeing patients to transition to industry. Tell us about that.
Actually, it was a relatively easy move. I had been, I did my residency, a post-residency in the labs, and then, the fellowship or the equivalent of, and at that time, we were, we were third or fourth reference center, actually international reference center, caring for kids with cancer and leukemias. And the unit award that was responsible for, we had an average, 1 or 2 deaths a year, 80 deaths, 1 or 2 deaths a week, so 80 deaths a year. And I did care the same manners, and not only myself, but the team, same manners that I did with Mary in the very, very first place. And then I realized that I was running out of steam. At that time, I had already five kids, all of very young age, and it was just running out of steam. And then I happened to, the very last patient I really seriously cared for was a young baby, actually. She was 14 or 15 months old, Marion, relapsing from the sarcoma with metastasis, so really a desperate prognosis. And then I and the team, we decided to try one last thing, and I got my hands on the drug, which was investigational drug at the time, coming from Japan, under the care from a development standpoint from Ron Poulenc, was very early on phase 1. And they gave me access to that drug on the compassionate use. And I spent literally 15 days, day and night, in the hospital caring for that kids who actually went into remission thanks to that drug and another investigational drug. And actually, to last I checked 10 years ago, she was still well and alive. That's the last patient I literally cared for. But it all, and then Ron Poulenc, we had Ron Poulenc, who was a former fellow from the Paris Hospital, which is a pretty prestigious, convinced me that you could practice medicine and in the same manner, but in a scale which was actually influencing many, many more patients than just a practice in the hospital setting. And I took the bet. I followed that and continued the hybrid practice, at the hospital and in the pharma for a few more years, and then realized he was absolutely correct. So it was a pretty easy transition, and I actually it took me a day or two to decide that. So it was not difficult, and I never ever regretted the move, because I've been able to give back so much to the community of patients with cancer to an extent that vastly exceeds what I could have been done.
Excellent. Well, you, as I mentioned, you had joined several of the high-profile, larger pharma firms earlier in your career, but without glossing anything over, I think some of your most significant and noteworthy achievements, not only in drug development, but in organizational development and people development, were clearly achieved at AstraZeneca. And would like to talk about that for a few minutes. My perspective of AstraZeneca at that time, as well as most of the other global pharma companies, is that they needed to address what could be done to shorten development times, to make smart decisions, to make smart go or no-go decisions. And like many large pharma companies, started to try to replicate organizational structure and quick decision-making that they saw in biotech. Difficult to achieve that overnight, but let's talk about your transition to AstraZeneca and the role or the roles you had there, and both in terms of, yes, your achievements, but people development, organizational development, and at that point.
Sure. So I joined AZ as a global head of clinical for oncology, and took a series of projects which were a portfolio which was pretty healthy, but oncology was not, the focal point, because the company was still a cardiovascular and Nexium, company, and they had been a series of failures, and not necessarily well understood lessons learned from these failures or difficulties. But the lessons I learned at AZ were essentially can be bucketed in two things. One have to do with leadership, and one have to do with what is pharma itself and how you implement that in how you run the operations and empower and support people. So from a leadership, what I obviously over these years, as I gradually pushed the portfolio and grew in responsibility, there were three things which were really, very important, and which I applied from the knowledge I had at the time, which was almost 20 years on serving at the project team level, meaning being on the front and having delivered so many submissions already there, but by myself. I applied the lessons of what worked well and what I would have liked to receive from the environment, when I was in these project level. And there were three things. One is to have a clear understanding what governance is, and governance, and ever since I've used that definition, is governance does only four things. One is to understand and define the risk. So not only take at face value what's being said, but to have a deep understanding of the risk so that at the portfolio and company level, then the governance can own the risk level and ascribe the risk level for your project. So this is something, and you cannot ascribe and define the risk you want to take unless you understand it. So that's the number one. The number two, is understand the time, and not the time that you want, but the time which is real. And very often, the governance is, or you have many stories about, say, no, a team asks for 9 months and then the leaders come back and say, find a way to make it in 6 months. I've always found this highly ineffective because that's not the reality. The reality is, what do you need what does it need to do it differently? And ask the people, on what they want, and then hold them to account and hold yourself to account to that time. And then if time means that the other thing has to be deprioritized or done differently, then you take, as a governance, the responsibility for that. And thus you hold the back of people who have defined for themselves what is their best possible performance. And that translates into a time element. And then you obviously have the means, which is, both the dollars, but also the people and so on and so forth. And that is a governance decision, how much you put to this. Do you go at risk or do you go gating and so on and so forth? And there's not one solution fitting for all. You just have to think very systematically with this 3 different things, which is a risk and uncertainties, the time and the means. And obviously all of this is towards a value. And actually, the value you pursue, is the least important, is very often presented as the most important driving factor. But in my mind, it's the least important. What you need to have is a good value, and then everything you do is commensurate to the value. And the value can be a commercial value, it can be a reputational value, it can just be a human value. One of the drug, has been a drug which has been repurposed and failed everywhere except for Hutchinson progeria syndrome, which is a very, very ultra-rare genetic disease. That's the rapid aging syndrome of kids who die of old age at the age of 10 or 12. And there are, at any single time point you have between 10 and 20 kids in the world living with this. So obviously the means you apply to pursue that indication are very different from other means. But you still do it. And that is the role of governance, to understand all of these elements and then create the framework to empower the teams and then hold them responsible for it, but take all so that's one thing that I experienced before, and I gradually instituted at AZ, and obviously that's a playbook that I was ready to play at Daiichusekyo. And that's number one, is clear governance, but that doesn't work on its own. I mean, there are 2 other things which are really important, which one is to have a structured advisory process. A lot of pharma suffer from the fact that the function have an opinion. So you take regulatory and stats and clinical operation and medical and clinical pharma. I mean, you name it, everybody has an opinion, and the project team struggles to really reconcile that. And either they keep recycling because you have leaders who keep asking the same question, or they go for the least demanding common denominator, or they take time. But it is a process by which the project team is assumed to be able to take down from the top of the different function or external input and distill that down and make the best possible recommendation. And then the next expectation is to go to governance and to seek ratification. And I found from the project themselves this to be highly ineffective. And what I really enjoyed, I created when I was on the project side and then instituted at AstraZeneca, and certainly also actually a lot on AstraZeneca, was a very structured governance where the senior leaders outside the project would make themselves available to the project at the project request in a manner which is such that it's safe. And by safe, it means that there's no format, there's no minutes, meaning that there's nothing that you can say, I told you to do this, and it's only valid for a question, not for a ratification. So it's not about, do you agree with my plan, but this is what I'm struggling with. and brainstorm and bring internal and sometimes a structured external internal advisory process which feeds into the project team so that the project team can unlock itself and has actually much, much better ability to define a path forward and then go to governance. And I found this to be extremely powerful. And the Tagrisso team, for instance, which obviously went very, very fast, used that process on a weekly basis, access to internal and sometimes external, and just for question. And so that's the second thing, which is from a leadership's perspective to ourselves leaders, sit in our right place, which is a source of experience and viewpoints, but not a source of telling the people what to do. And thus, that leads me to the third thing, which is to empower the project team to essentially be responsible for what they wanted to do and always come up with one or two options, which was much, much easier because they had that advisory process. And come to governance and then just hold them to and high-performing team, you don't monitor, you rely on their ability to tell you when they are unable to do what they said they would do. And you never tell them, oh, please go for faster. And not, you say, what do you need to do your best? Because the driver is, we do all what is humanly possible to deliver our science for patients. So these are the three things I learned from a leadership's perspective over these years at AstraZeneca. So I don't know if this is helpful, but this is how I would summarize it.
No, it's very helpful. And you and I have talked about this subject many times over the years. Pushing authority and accountability down into the project team or the cross-functional team level. And if you have the right people at that level, and if you have the right kind of leaders affording them the opportunities to be accountable and to make decisions with the support of governance. And very interesting the way you position that, where governance had a lot of interaction with them, but so much of it was off the record, supportive exchange of ideas. At some point, the project team comes to governance with proposals and budgets and strategy, but up until that point, they're getting the wisdom and the benefit of senior level governance, but they are accountable for the decisions and the strategy and then the implementation.
No, absolutely. And what this allowed, I'm not saying this is the only way to do it, but that has been my experience. But what I observe is that it creates autonomy, it creates agility, it creates accountability, and it generates an informal intensity, which is really what you want, which is what we do is important, not who we are. So it deconstructs that whole concept of hierarchy and I'm a function head, or I'm the head of this and that, and it actually brings down the intensity on what we do individually and collectively, and that's this informal intensity where what we do matters more than who we are.
And when you're talking about agility and those other attributes, might have been a bit of an oxymoron in the world of big pharma years ago, but I think what I've seen is it doesn't have to be the AstraZeneca model, but a construct of cross-functional leadership that is supported and where the accountability and the autonomy is awarded to the right people who are awarded those types of responsibilities. Talk a little bit about, again, full disclosure, you and I have worked over the years in finding the right people, the right kind of phenotype that you've seen in these cross-functional leaders. I will say two of the things that I've observed in working with you over the years, which I would invite you to comment on, is I have seen you, to use a phrase, eat the pain of leaving a position open rather than putting somebody in that was just going to be a role filler. I've also seen you award responsibility to individuals who this might have been a pretty big step up for them, and they were rising stars as opposed to proven leaders at a particular level. So I'm curious about your thoughts about your persistence in keeping your standards high, and while also being very receptive to taking a look at rising stars and awarding rising stars important roles.
Yeah, so I was taking note because I think you said a couple of things important. That I think my persistence in keeping the standard high is something which is pretty clear. Sometimes it's it creates noise in the system, but that's okay because at the end of the day, my ultimate value proposition comes from the intensity I have in pursuing the obligation we have to deliver science to patients, and that's ultimately what matters. That's number one. And my assumption is that when you do this, then people will reward themselves. They see this is the biggest reward, more than anything else, more than statute, more than even financial reward or level of authority and so on and so forth. The ability to actually contribute to that good is my core value proposition. I've very often been told that when I interview, actually, I run very atypical interviews because it's almost like the performance development interview you have with your direct reports during the normal course of business, and where I actually take interest, deep down interest in understanding the person and what drives him or her, and how not only he or she can be successful, but what is the deeper motive and the longer view, not necessarily the career path they have for themselves, but the real deeper view of what is absolute success for themselves. And very often people say that these are very atypical interviews for themselves, actually very touching interviews, because we go very deep down and less about the technical and show me what you did, in this difficult or in this success and so on and so forth. Because I think that going much deeper and much faster, but then that allowed me to pick up folks who actually, I believe, I became convinced that they would fit. And then very often I offered ill-defined jobs, for instance, and with the support and mentoring so that they would define for themselves the role. And that has happened, even for pretty senior roles, VPs, senior VPs, and I created a role for the person. So, and then because of his or her attribute, experience, and potential, and so on. And that resulted in this transformation that you made reference to, and this could be internal appointments. So I appointed, people from one function to another role, but also external hires, where I had commercial leaders, for instance, coming and being project team leaders. They have never been project team leaders before, but and so on and so forth. So it is right. It's hard to reproduce because this is something that it's my own, if you will, recipe, for engaging with people and then connecting and then making the choice. But the deep down thing is this relentless pursuit of perfection and sharing that deep down obligation, more than anything else. I very often, I'm turned personally off by people who care about, titles. I think titles are totally irrelevant, as well as org charts. I spent 5 years at Daiichusekyo and never used an org chart, never presented an org chart, actually never maintained an org chart for my organization. Just, I deeply believe in the power of influence more than anything else, and the power of decree. And that's how it was conducted.
Let's talk about your transition to Daiichusekyo. At the time that you joined them, my perception of the scenario was they had developed some very respectable internal medicinal chemistry and molecular biology functions. They had acquired a couple of biotech companies, but they were still a primary care company that had the possibility of developing some exciting oncology. But with that, again, my perception from an organizational standpoint, you had a lot of freedom to start with a blank sheet of paper. As you said, you never drew an org chart. You needed leadership. You needed smarts. Tell me a little bit about building that organization and getting the right kind of phenotype of individuals there. And again, I know I saw you repeatedly. Yes, there were specific positions that you needed to have filled, but then I saw you create roles around individuals that could deliver value for you. So much more of a blank sheet of paper, for lack of a better phrase. So would be interested in your thoughts about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I joined Daiichusekyo, number one, because I'd been many years at AZ, and then it was just time, and time to move on. But also, I joined Daiichusekyo because Daiichusekyo was, I liked the culture, and I still like the culture. I felt it was a fabulous, highly respectful culture. I'd worked with Japanese before, multiple times. I led teams in Japan, so I knew what it entailed. But more importantly, they were committed to oncology, but they had no idea what they were committed to. So they were to oncology because it was more a business decision, meaning that this is where growth and pharma was going. So when I joined, the commitment to oncology was, trying to be as everyone else was at the time, which was in cell therapy and immuno-oncology therapy, which interestingly, we are an oncology respected and well-known organization now, but we are absolutely not in these two fields. And I knew it, and that was okay, because the key for me was that commitment to, and then what I walked in, we reorganized pretty substantially, and on purpose, I asked for that, the organization, so that I would have a completely new job. So I would not fill in a job. It was a new organization. And with that new, it was less the org chart itself, but the newness, which was critical. And with that newness came three things which were absolutely critical. One was a mandate. I had a clear mandate to pull the organization. I was the highest ranking, knowledgeable and experienced in oncology, and the commitment was to. So the mandate was clear. The support was extremely clear, and then the science was there, and that's what the stroke of gold for me and for us was that I actually did before I joined. I did my due diligence, and I saw what was not visible even to Daiichusekyo itself, which is I saw the invisible. I identified something which is big, and actually under-promised and over-delivered. And but not but I saw the opportunity and then just apply my methods and the playbook I had at AZ to just turn this around. And Daiichusekyo was remarkable because they maintained that mandate and support, and the science was absolutely exceptional and continues to be exceptional, actually probably peerless in terms of medicinal chemistry and so on. And the management, the board, the CEO, followed me all in. And from the get-go, from even 2 or 3 months in, I changed, and it was, they were in the complete shock, if you will, that they didn't even know that this existed, and what they had said 3 months ago was no longer valid, but they still followed through and then put money on the table, changed the organization, made massive investment in manufacturing, because that was the time-limiting, the rate-limiting success factor for the drugs, and just followed. So this is how it worked, in terms of that transition. It was the ability to see that and to identify big, under-promise, and deliver bigger. But that was done. The secret is that it's done because I drive an extreme rigor in following the science to make great medicine which address unique patient needs. I've never been personally interested in doing Me Too's, or second or third in class, except the second or third is best in class. And Tagrisso was a best in class drug, and we delivered that, And the same is true for the portfolio of Daiichusekyo is in extreme rigor, and sometimes it is rough because it means that you have to deprioritize and stop what doesn't matter. But that's what also lends itself to the extreme power and in advancing very, very fast because you're just so laser focused on what is right and adding value.
That was I observing and occasionally working with you. It has been an incredible development machine that was created there, and it's very challenging to convey what that is through an org chart. It's a culture, it's an attitude. As you say, it starts in many ways with the interviewing process of, you can evaluate somebody's skills fairly quickly, but what makes them tick and what role can they play the best? I think something really special was created, and the proof is in all of the accomplishments over the last several years. And I would assume, not to put words in your mouth, you must feel very gratified with the organization you built, the culture you built, the achievements of HER2 and the rest of the pipeline. But now you're off to your latest adventure and bringing all of your experience in organization building and leadership into what is now truly a biotech environment, which should be agile and decisive and fast moving. Talk to me about your thoughts about joining Centessa.
Sure. But before I do this, I just want to elaborate a quick thing on Daiichusekyo, which is
please.
The success came from creating what was called Cancer Enterprise, which was a completely unknown thing. And it just was not creating change by defining what the future would be and what would be the steps, and then a process, a PMO, and something which takes a year and a half before you actually begin to train people. And then, no, it was through creating the experience from the get-go within the first few weeks, and then building on that experience and then expanding the sphere of influence and aggregating, and then people having the experience of good and great, and they just embrace and pull themselves in. So that had been my approach. I respect the PMO and the need sometimes to have a far more structured. And one of the things I've learned also is to supplement myself with leaders who actually bring some stability in the system, because I drive so much instability and uncertainty. And it is critical to also create stability and decoding and translation for individuals of what does it mean for me in terms of work. So that balance is critical. And that was essentially what Cancer Enterprise was. Now back to Centessa, Centessa, really struck me as a fantastic opportunity for two reasons. One is because it's almost for pharma, but Daiichusekyo was for cancer, and Daiichusekyo had the Cancer Enterprise. Here it's a pharma enterprise. It's all about reinventing what pharma is, and when you think about it, pharma is about projects and about the ability to grow and and progress in a manner which is fit for purpose. And for years and years, I described project team and team leaders as quote unquote CEO of a project. Here you go, and Centessa, they are the CEOs of a company. They have so it's literally walking the talk by having that degree of empowerment. But at the same time, removing from these biotechs, these individual biotechs, the amount of time that many biotech have to spend time in convincing the investors and and shareholders, public, about their own future, and actually having their eyes on the next step and giving them the lens and the support that would be meeting the potential of a drugs. So that's one aspect of this enterprise, which is phenomenal. The second is to actually, because we start with a blank sheet, I can employ this core concept that I've tested, which is, what governance is, how you empower, how you structure the advice, And then the last thing, which is how do you really employ alternative ways of working? And it's meaning that if you want to run, you can design, and I've tested in my prior life, at AstraZeneca and more also at Daiichusekyo, the different ways of employing the different partners that you work with, from CROs to academic sites and so on and so forth. So, for instance, all the AROs, the work I've done at AZ first and now, at Daiichusekyo on Sarah Cannon and employing them and empowering them and bringing Sarah Cannon, which is a world-leading academic research organization, and we brought their leaders to our governance, which is an honor. I mean, literally, they attend internal governance at Daiichusekyo, and that was true also at AZ. This is a way of working which actually builds on the win-win and ownership and then commitment of your partner. It's no longer a transactional relationship. It's actually a win-win relationship you establish with not only individuals, but also organization. The same is true with a coalition with Synos Health that we established at Daiichusekyo, where we move past the transactional, and not because of different incentives in terms of financial incentive and clawbacks and so on and so forth, but much more about understanding what is unique and what they deep down aspire. And the CRO deep down aspires of motivating their people. The biggest challenge that CRO has is not to have a top line business. The biggest challenge they have is to keep the right people and reduce the turnover. If you understand that from a partnering perspective, then there I have ways to bring in these people because I have great science and we have laser focus on everything. And so if you create that partnership and the coalition, that changes the relationship from a transactional to what we call the coalition. So these are two examples of what I intend to draw lessons from at Centessa, so that we organize ourselves in a manner which is fit for purpose. And help this individual company grow and meet the challenges and the opportunity of their science for patients, but in a manner which is empowered by the experience that we bring.
Well, in so many ways, that comes full circle at a much grander scale to what you instituted back with AstraZeneca, keeping the responsibility with the people who are close to the science and who should know best and to be able to make their best judgments with the insight and support of senior governance.
Exactly.
Yeah, interesting. Antoine, I and a lot of other people are going to be watching Centessa with a lot of great interest and looking forward to great press releases and data releases from its portfolio companies in the time to come. I did want to spend another moment or two because you've also talking about what makes people tick, and we talked about your original medical interests and passion for patients. On a personal note, in addition to all of the things you've done professionally, you've adopted Down syndrome babies. You own a charitable and very successful catering and restaurant company that is staffed by individuals with Down syndrome. Again, I mentioned your charitable philanthropy at the beginning of our discussion. Give us some insight about a little bit more about you on that personal and family side.
Sure. Yeah. It started, something like 38 years ago now, when I met my wife to be, I actually proposed the next day, literally, and I was annoyed that she took 3 weeks to say yes, but and ever since, we didn't have a grand plan.
You look for agility and fast decision-making on the family side, too.
I'm a serial offender here. But joke apart, we didn't have a grand plan. So we had 6 kids on our own, and these 6 kids actually now, have kids on their own. So we have 10 grandkids, soon 2 more. And that's very rewarding. But then we adopted the first kid, as number 7, who had Down syndrome. And then the next one was at the request of the older kids who said it would be very sad that he would be alone. And presented with evidence, we said, yeah, that makes sense, And then, when you are 8 and then we moved to the US, the support and the ability to essentially grow peoples and with special needs in the US, it's much, much easier. We had the means at time, so we just added 2 more, because when you go from 8 to 10, actually the incremental percent is actually very minimal. So there was no grand plan, but you're right, we ended up with 10 kids, of whom 4 were adopted as babies and have Down syndrome. You also mentioned the nonprofit. Actually, we do not own. We created, actually donated, funded, not only myself, but very substantially, this nonprofit organization, which is called the Blue Bear Special Meal in Princeton, New Jersey, which offers a place of work which combines, support and dignity for anybody and individuals with intellectual development and disabilities, and this came as a drive to offer recognition of a difference, and I knew it could work because I'd witnessed the similar experience mostly in France, but also in another place in the US, and we just wanted to, not have a business which is driven by charity, because but the business which just offers, visible respect to individuals and demonstrate that this business is a viable business. And it is, it is a viable business in a sense that this is a business now 2 years in existence, which brings in probably between $35,000 and $40,000 of of sales. And people come because they love what they eat, and the environment is beautiful, and most of them don't even know that it is a nonprofit, and we do it in a manner that, drives people for the right reason, and we pay our employees, it's a competitive employment. We pay them at the same rate as neurotypical individuals, and treat them as such. It just, what you have to do is to provide what you provide in any environment of life, which is understanding and support and expectation, and that's what works. Obviously they need a little bit more support and longer support. Employee number 1 took 20 minutes to peel a potato on the first day. Now he is able to make from scratch, quiche, which have people come again and again because they are the best quiche in town and probably in the States.
And I've had it. It's really, really good.
So it is. But that is part of that drive I personally have, which is if you can do something, you just do it. It's what we do is more important than who we are.
Well, Antoine, on that note, I think that is an outstanding closing point for our conversation today. I think that the insight you provided is going to be fascinating and interesting to our viewers. I really can't thank you enough for your time, and I sincerely believe that we've had a great conversation that will allow people to get a great insight into a very unique leader. And I wish you all the best at Centessa. Of course, wish you all the best on a personal note. And thank you again for your time today, very much.
Sure. And Victor, if I may, I also want to thank you personally. You have actually been a critical contributor to the successes I had at AstraZeneca and Daiichusekyo in following me with this atypical way of attracting talent and bringing talent in. And so I just want to acknowledge this also.
We've partnered pretty well. It's been a good ride for both of us. So thank you again, my friend, and we'll talk again real soon.
Likewise. Thank you. Bye-bye.